Good morning, everyone. Chris here again from Physiologic. Today, another webinar, but this time we're going to talk a little bit about load management. And load management is a term that gets thrown around quite a bit these days. It seems to be the sexy term that goes around at the moment, particularly in terms of injury prevention. So hopefully today I'm able to shed a little bit of light on it today. It is a fairly complicated subject to talk about, but hopefully you can get a good grasp on it today. So let's get stuck in, hey? So just a little bit about us. Obviously, you've heard this before in the last webinar. So we've been servicing the southern end of the Gold Coast for about 25 years, and our aim is to provide the highest quality services in rehab and sports medicine, but also general health and wellbeing as well. Okay. So I guess the big question is, what is load management? You tend to hear about it quite a bit, particularly in games like cricket. Now that AFL footy is becoming probably a bit more intense, players are getting probably towards the end of their career. Managing their loads is really important. So you might hear it in terms of that as well. A couple of other things that you might sort of hear this in, tennis is a big one as well. Obviously, because of the amount of tennis that they play, soccer as well, they need to split up their loads so that it's manageable for each player, so that each player doesn't break down. And that's exactly what it is. So it's about making those players available more often and keeping them in the best shape possible. And essentially, it's about keeping those players on the ground for as long as they can throughout the season and managing their bodies. A good point just down the bottom there is that appropriate load management can help determine whether or not a person is able to cope with their current training demands. So obviously, if they're not coping, then their chance of injury is quite high, or they probably will be injured. So it's a really good way to identify, what training loads are appropriate and minimising that injury risk. So that's really important. They've done a lot of research in this space, but unfortunately, I think it is quite vague, really, and I think this graph sort of sums it up. We're trying to identify that sweet spot with our training. And as you can see, it's sort of in the middle of the graph there. And then a large portion of it is more that increased injury risk, or that danger zone, if you like. And obviously, it's really quite vague. And the way they actually identify your acute chronic workload, which is what they try to identify to find out if that load's suitable, is they actually find out rate of perceived exertion, okay, and we'll talk about that later, over the duration or the time, the amount of training, I suppose. And then they identify a figure, and depending on that figure, puts them in either the sweet spot, the danger zone, or the grey area in between. As you can see, there's a lot of grey area. So at this stage, this seems to be the best model that we have. But everything with physio, everything with sports medicine, it's ever changing. So it will hopefully keep you in the loop as the years go on. So obviously today is our focus is on minimising injury risk. We've sort of discussed this a little bit before, but the common injuries in AFL, your hamstring strains, your muscle strains, ankle sprains are up there as well. You can also get a little bit of tendon pain. And we haven't mentioned it on the slide there, but let's not forget ACL injuries as well. Because they are the big rock, and the amount of time that you spend off the field is quite significant when compared to other injuries. And then if we sort of refer that back to junior football, so those common injuries, those Osgood slatters, so knee pain essentially, patellofemoral pain, once again, kneecap pain, severs or heel pain in adolescence. And then you've got your fractures as well, something to be aware of. So they're obviously your common ones. And these injuries in particular, not so much the fractures, but the top four are really influenced by the amount of load going through the body. So if you can manage to get your loads right, the risk of these injuries is really reduced quite significantly. Yeah, so causes are common, like we've sort of spoke about in the other video. Reductions in muscle strength and growing periods, and changes in biomechanics and how the child will move. The big one, load management. I see this a lot in soccer, that a lot of soccer kids just, they train 3-4 times a week, plus they've got a game on game day. And during that period, there's just not enough adequate rest. And they're letting themselves down. Their bodies are just aren't able to sustain the amount of effort that they're trying to put in. The good thing about AFL is we seem to have it down pat. Junior footy, in particular, there doesn't seem too many issues in regards to load management. Generally speaking, you only train a couple of times a week and play on the weekend, which I feel is a good mix. On top of that, if you add a little bit of strength training, you're halfway there. So I think the AFL community should be really proud that they've actually managed their loads quite well. And even with the Suns Academies and all the other representative teams, it seems like AFL's really pioneering and making sure that their kids are staying healthy. So I think from that point of view, we're doing really well. So what we can do, once again, last week we spoke about how physios can increase muscle strength, improve technique in terms of running and jumping, improving motor patterns. But if you can improve the knowledge on load management and training in particular, can go a really long way. Once again, has a really significant influence on injuries. Okay, so let's go through a couple of things. So training cycles or periodization is not a technique, but a really easy way to split up your training program. So generally speaking, earlier on in the season, and if you just look at professional footy clubs as an example, early on in the season or in their pre-season phase, they seem to do a lot more running during that phase. They try to build up a base. They try to make sure that their cardiovascular fitness is really, really good, and they're fit enough to be able to run out games. And then slowly, generally in 4 weekly periods, which we call macro cycles, they would shift their focus from either cardiovascular to probably more speed or power. And then, once they get in season, they taper off their fitness and they focus a bit more on skills. So each cycle essentially has a different goal depending on what they want to achieve as a team. Once again, AFL seem to do it really well. They've got the basics down pat. They work on their fitness early on, and then they slowly, as the year goes on, transition more into gameplay. Yeah, so the goals for each session, like I said, it can be split up into more skill-based and then fitness-based. So you got cardiovascular fitness, like I mentioned, speed, strength, power, those sorts of things, and then skills. So obviously earlier on in the season, particularly with junior footies, if you can get those skills really primed early on, handball and kicking, etc., and then transition that more into gameplay, then done pretty well. Likewise with fitness, if you build a good solid base first and work hard, get your Ks under your belt, then transition more into the speed and the speed play, and then you transition that more into games. Same with strength, so you build up a good strength base and then you slowly transition into power. Really important to split it up into segments, and once again, a really easy way to minimise injury risk. Obviously, this is probably a bit more relevant to professional athletes. However, it's not unheard of for a junior footy team to do the odd beat test or whatnot. But fitness testing gives you a good measure of improvement as the year goes on. So the 2K time trial, I've got 3K on the slide, but the 2K time trial is generally a really good indicator of where players are at in terms of their cardiovascular fitness. And they use that a lot more in the professional ranks. A beat test, obviously a classic, everyone's done it at school, but once again, really good measure of where your fitness is at, particularly in terms of aerobic capacity. And then you get a couple other there, so the 20-metre sprint, standing vertical jump, 20-metre sprint, obviously built for speed. So if you wanted to monitor that, then doing that, say on an 8-weekly basis, if you wanted to do it on a 4-weekly basis, then you can. And then standing vertical jump, more based for power. So this is essentially an annual plan. So like I said, every cycle is split up into different groups, depending on what your goal is. So if you look at the annual plan there, you've got the preparation phase, the competitive phase, and then the transition, which essentially means the off season. Okay. In the preparation phase, you just want to go through a bit more general. So, for example, an professional AFL player, an elite midfielder roughly runs around 15 kilometres a day in a game, sorry. So you want to make sure that they can build that capacity. So they may do, for 3 sessions during the week, 10Ks in those 3 sessions. So it might be a 30-kilometre week where they'd split it up into 3 10K sessions. And that should be sufficient for them to be able to run out a 15-kilometre game if they are. They then go into their specific preparation. So as we know, footy is a very dynamic sport. You're never just running at the same pace for the entire game. You know, you go through periods where you're running, you're sprinting, you're jogging, you're walking, you're even having a breather from time to time. And so you need to be really specific during that phase. And so during that time, a team might work more on speed or agility, or change of direction, that sort of thing. Likewise, if you split that up into strength and power, power is a bit more functional and more specific to games. So you might work on your strength or building size initially, and then you will try to transition that more into power. So you're pushing, pulling, and jumping, that sort of thing. If you look at the top, so that's a fair bit of information there, and hopefully it's made it a little bit easier. If you look at the top, it gives you a general outline of how intense training generally becomes. So you want to start off quite slow initially and then build up your intensity as the season goes on. And then once you start to hit finals where you need to prepare, if you reduce that intensity down so that recovery becomes the big focus. So generally speaking, your volume is a lot higher because the intensity is lower. If the intensity is high, the volume drops. Hopefully that makes sense. But this gives you a good little outline of how that works. So monitoring sessions. Now, obviously, I want to make it practical for you guys in junior footy, because the reality is, I mean, you're not professional footy clubs, you don't have GPS systems. But a really nice, easy way is to monitor RPE. Now, that stands for rate of perceived exertion. So it's a really good way of understanding how hard that player believes that the session was. So to give you an example, on a scale, it's generally rated from 1 to 10. Can be different depending on the system, but 1 to 10 is the easiest. 1 generally means very light activity, so they're hardly any exertion. It's like watching television. The examples there are great. And 10s being the max effort, so they're just completely out of breath. They can't talk. On the other hand, a 4 to 6, they're breathing heavy, but they can still hold a conversation. Okay, and this is a really excellent way to monitor week by week. So, for example, if you just had not a whiteboard, but a clipboard, and wrote down what every player thought the week was like out of 10, that gives you a small gauge on how hard they actually thought the sessions were. It's a really simple and effective way to try and manage loads and see if the players are able to sustain it. Now, if you wanted to take it a little bit further, obviously it's really sort of dependent on time, and I understand that a lot of coaches, they're not full-time, they all work, and they probably only commit a certain amount of time to it. However, if you did want to take it a step further, taking wellness scores is another really effective way. So once again, it's a 1 out of 10 system where the person will rate their soreness, things like sleep, general fatigue, stress levels, lower back tightness, things like that. Depends what you really wanted to look at. And 1 is generally poor and 10 is excellent. So if you track that over time and started to notice an increase, or sorry, a reduction in their soreness measures, for example, then you can have a look at that, take that information, go to the player and say, look, I've noticed that your soreness scores have actually reduced over the couple of weeks. Do you feel like taking a break? Things like that, really effective in just managing those loads, like I said. And you can measure anything. So I mentioned back tightness as well, hamstring tightness, groin tightness, whatever you really wanted, okay? But once again, it's a very easy and effective way to manage loads. Now, all those are subjective. So that's how the patient or how the player feels. What the professionals are able to do is actually objectively measure it. Okay, so they use GPS systems, they use live wellness dashboards. They've got all these systems and athlete data management systems in place to be able to optimize their management essentially. And obviously chops and changed a lot over the years, but using that information can be really useful. Once again, keeping it practical for you guys, you don't have things like this, so that's why RPE can be really effective. Here's another infographic. So you can notice those big spikes in loads and the rest periods, and there's a lot to it. There's a lot of information that you can get from athlete monitoring. But once again, from a practical point of view, it's just an example of what they do. So essentially, what we want to try and prevent is overtraining. Okay, so overtraining is when your training exceeds the recovery. And this can result in obviously reduced performance and increased injury risk, but also things like burnout, general health becomes quite impaired as well. So they might get sick a little bit more. Essentially, we want to try and prevent that as best as we can. As we know, kids generally play better when they're enjoying what they do, and by overtraining them, it's just not a really suitable way to, once again, keep them interested in the sport, but to keep them off the injury list. You might notice Alistair Lynch up there, so that's in the top picture there. So he suffered chronic fatigue for a number of years whilst at Brisbane. So, I think there was a little bit of controversy with medications and whatnot, but nevertheless, he seemed to be a lot more tired than normal. And so they had to really work hard at managing his loads throughout the year so that he was able to sustain a really good performance on game day. So a couple of things to watch. So obviously the number of sessions that a player will do. Okay, like I said, 2 times a week is generally pretty good, plus a game on the weekend. Chuck a couple of strengthening sessions and I think you've nailed it. If the players complain of soreness often, that's probably something to monitor as well, because generally kids shouldn't be sore. They should bounce back very quickly. Certainly after the first couple of sessions when they're not used to it, that's really normal. But if they're complaining all the time, it's generally a bit of an indicator that they're probably not managing their training loads. They're mentally fatigued. If they're suffering that burnout, if they're not keen to play, if they don't want to go to training, there's probably something to look at. There's probably a bit more to that than meets the eye. Once again, probably not managing their training loads as well. From a practical point of view, their school results are suffering. So look, it's just one of those things that comes with the mental fatigue aspect. Potentially they're not getting enough sleep. Potentially they're becoming a bit anxious or stressed, and as a result, the school results are suffering. So in all, there's no recommended amount. However, just be aware of these things. I think it's really important that we don't burn out our kids. And at the end of the day, if kids want to have a really good nudge at potentially a professional career, you want them to at least play. And if they're not playing when they're in senior football, then it's unlikely that they're going to get picked up. Yeah, so just be aware. So, yeah, burnout. Obviously, with overtraining, players can become burnt out and they just don't feel like playing the game anymore. They don't obviously want to participate. There's a picture of a list of players here, and all of these players have gone through some form of mental health or burnout situation. So we've got Tom Boyd there. He was quite public with his mental health problems, being the number one draft pick and whatnot, not being able to, I guess, exceed expectations. Dale Thomas, he was on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and said at one point he just hated playing the game. Magic Door took a little bit of time out. Lance Franklin likewise. I think he almost took a whole year out. And Adam Treloar, once again, very public battle with mental health. A lot of this is probably not related to their training, but nevertheless, making sure that the players are being listened to and feeling mentally drained is something just to monitor. And just make sure that they're having fun. At the end of the day, if you're overtraining players, then they're not going to enjoy what they do. If they don't enjoy what they do, they're not going to play well. So yeah, it's just something to look out for. So I guess in summary, guys, and I hope it has been a lot of information, but I hope it's made sense. That the purpose of load management is to reduce the risk of injury and keep players on the field. Okay. And once again, one of the easiest ways to do that is just break your training into cycles, because it's really good to monitor their player loads and then, once again, to avoid injuries. And from a practical point of view, something that you can give a go is try to monitor the RPE. Let's start off on a weekly basis and just see how the player feels after training in games, because it will give you a lot of information on whether or not the player is struggling to get through the year, or whether or not their training loads are sufficient. Okay, guys, that's pretty much sums it up. I really hope you enjoyed that and got a little bit of information. I'm sure it will come in handy at some point. I think it's really valuable to know. All right, guys, hope you have a great day. If you have any questions, drop a question on the link below or the box below, and I'm more than happy to address it. Okay, thanks, guys. Bye.